there are now 32 of us, that feels very auspicious. Welcome, everybody, to All the Kabbalah You Really Need to Know in 72 Minutes or Less, this time with more sex. So we're going to be talking about gender, sex, Kabbalah, all the things, and bringing all of ourselves and all of our parts to the table. And so let's bring ourselves here. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
Love that. Excellent. I see a few familiar faces in the room who are here for yet another Kabbalah class with Miriam. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Miriam BatAsherah Green. I actually cut my OTO teeth in Scarlet Woman Lodge, so I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm now with Blazing Star Oasis. And I'm going to be talking about topics that are near and dear to my heart, which is the intersection of integrating polarities toward new synthesis Kabbalistically and doing it in an embodied way that brings ourselves integrated fully to our magical work. I'm also a genderqueer individual. I am a queer individual. And increasingly, I've discovered that my Kabbalah is inseparable with those pieces of me. I often find in magical practice that I need to run a sort of mental translation device, especially around sex magic, for my ability to participate in that discussion. What I want to do today is to minimize that for everybody in the room. So this is not a queer discussion, although we will be talking about things that are hella queer. This is not a conversation for trans or genderqueer people, although I want people to be included explicitly in a way that we maybe aren't always in an OTO environment. But this is for everybody. The law is for all. So if you are a cis straight person, you're going to get some techniques out of today that will help you deepen your Kabbalah and your sex magic. If you are a trans person, a genderqueer person, a queer person, an asexual person, you're going to get some ideas today that will help you bring yourself to sex magic with a little less translation than maybe we normally go through when we talk about this stuff. As I mentioned, polarities and syntheses are really core to my work. I've been doing this for 20 years. I pretty much cut my esoteric teeth in 1994 by taking a copy of 777 and putting it in a 1-2-3 spreadsheet and trying to teach myself the Kabbalah. And I was a practicing witch for many years before that. Increasingly, I find that the way I once understood Kabbalah as the tree, or later as the alphabet, or as gematria, or words of power, every time I think I've got a grasp on it, that grasp moves away, and I'm going towards something that is more and more ineffable. But the common thread in every bit of Kabbalistic work I have ever done, especially when it's resonant and magical and powerful and alive for me, is where I have points of tension that are resolving in opposites. These dudes attest to that as well. Without doing polarity and synthesis work, we can't build the cube of space. We cannot work with the 3 classical Hebrew elements. We cannot work with our Yetzer HaTov and our Yetzer Hara, for those of you who are here for the Muppets. If you weren't here for the Muppets, I'll give that talk again one day. So this session today is not explicitly a work of Kabbalah, but it is as close to Kabbalah as breathing in is to breathing out. This is the way we're going to orient our work. So, speaking of which, if you've attended my classes in the past, you know that I like to work experientially. So we're going to start with some experiential work just to get grounded. We'll move into some sort of heady gender 101 stuff just to get everybody talking with the same language and on the same page. And then we're going to move back into a lot of experiential work. If you are here with a friend, there are some partner exercises later. If you are here on your own, I invite you to find somebody you might want to work with. So maybe just take a moment to figure out who that is now so we're not chaotic later. And if you really feel like you'd like to do the partner work in yourself, that's fine too. Okay. And what is that?
I said, can we be poly?
If you can work out the scheduling issue to do it within our time constraints, I invite you to be poly. Yes, that's a good point. And it actually gets to something that I did want to say before we start, which is, like I said, every time I get to the end of my horizon, there's a new horizon. For the sake of simplicity, and because I had 10 hours of material that I've cut down to 72 minutes or less, I'm going to be talking about paired workings, but I do not want to exclude the poly among us from the discussion. So I'll even talk a little bit later about how this stuff can get really complex and stack. But we're not going to spend a lot of time there, and that's simply a limitation of time. Also, if I don't tackle your very favorite topic on Kabbalah or gender or whatnot, it is simply because this could easily be a 10-week course, and I'm narrowing it down. So before we go any further, I want to just take a moment to align our souls and to work very directly with one of those points of polarity and synthesis. If you can, make yourself comfortable. You may want to soften your gaze or even close your eyes to let this hotel space drop away. Just concentrate for a moment on the breath. Feeling air moving in and moving out. Recognizing that in this place, as in all places, our relationship to the ineffable is as close as breathing in is to breathing out. And that may feel like a center that is the circumference of all. And we call that element of air that sustains us Aleph. Aleph the fool, Aleph the air, Aleph the inspiration. Just breathe into that centered place of Aleph. Maybe take a moment to say the letter with me. Aleph. Aleph. And from that place of air and center and inspiration, move the energy down into the pelvis, into the sex, into the grounded, watery core that connects butt with ground or seat, and feel that grounded, yet flexible, yet watery energy, and we call that energy mem. And feel that mem force keeping fluidity at the center of our work. And take a moment to consider the letter and let us call it together as mem. Mem. And then moving that energy up to the point of fire, the fire of motion, the fire of passion, the fire of inspiration, the fire that we don't need to agree on everything, but we can talk about it with our teeth. And those teeth are called shin. Shin, 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 like a shining flame. We can call that letter together from the top of our heads, shin. Shin. Just take a moment to feel where that aleph and mem and shin create a center point with very, very different energies that resolve into a new whole. And when you're ready, open your eyes and bring yourself here for this work. So, like I said, I've been a witch and a magician for all of my adult life, literally. I'm currently pursuing ordination as a deacon and a priest in the EGC. And I used to think that I was the only genderqueer or trans person in the OTO, which I'm kind of really happy to discover is not true. Thank you, NOTOCON. But, you know, part of it comes out of the fact that when I was a young chaos magician, I really liked to be in your face. But part of it just comes out of a desire for inclusivity that I really want to make this visible, right? It's not that I want to make a big deal out of things, but neither sister nor brother quite fits for me. And that's interesting, because I'm in a highly gendered context in which I can never forget that I'm coloring outside the lines. There is room for all of that experience here, and there is room for different experience. As it happens, I'm also now in a new magical experiment. I have purchased my own war engine. Alternately, I've got an island which I'm fortifying. I'm one of the current owners of Wicked Grounds in the Bay Area, which is one of the country's only BDSM and kink cafes. So I literally spend my life now doing the kinky queer revolution and making a safe space for other people who color outside the lines, whether that's BDSM or age play or puppy play, or I've seen it all. And so, you know, for me, this is all about building the kinky queer revolution for the purpose of bringing light, life, love, and liberty to all people. My co-owner is also, I'm also trained as a reclaiming witch. She is also a witch in that tradition. It is very much a magical process and project. And so with that being my day-to-day backdrop now, I see the world differently than I did when I was a consultant. And I see my magic differently than I did back then. And so, you know, for me, ultimately what it comes down to is, regardless of which tradition I am in, the law is for all. If you're asexual, demisexual, trans, cis, genderqueer, gender fuck, as Carol Queen used to say, the law is for all of us. It's one of our birthrights. And so if you're here and you're less familiar with queer and genderqueer topics, my first portion of the presentation, I'm going to do just a real quick Gender Theory 101 so that everybody's sort of operating from a position of increased inclusivity as we encounter these ideas in our community. It's not really my favorite spot. I'm not a big academic speaker. I like doing stuff. So then we'll spend the rest of the session doing some practical exercises together that are not sexual, but that will give you something that you can take home to your sex magic practice, solo or othered, and throw that into the pot. And again, I just want to note this is sort of the work of a lifetime for me, and this could be a 10-week class, so by necessity I'm going to go a little bit quickly through particularly the introductory material, so you guys have time to practice. So gender magic, sex magic, what the hell is this gender stuff? Why do we need more signs for our bathrooms? You know, I've heard a joke that the best definition of cisgender may be that nobody looks at you funny when you go to a bathroom. So I find it funny. I live in San Francisco now, and the norms there are different. I lived in Texas for many years. Even as a genderqueer person, this stuff does not come naturally to me. Going into the service industry and working in a coffee shop, I had to beat calling people sir and ma'am out of my system, and I knew better. So I do live in San Francisco now. Feel like I'm living in a hotbed of modern gender theory. People are coloring outside the lines, and every time I think I know where all the colors go, there's some new colors over here that I haven't paid attention to. The language changes quickly because, like any new science, it is evolving quickly. We don't use floppy disks now, right? But that was only 20 years ago we did. The language that was used for gender theory, and particularly genderqueer theory, only 20 years ago is in some cases offensive and outdated. So I hope that I don't step into any terms mistakenly, and I apologize in advance if I do. I realize not everybody is steeping in this every day. I do think, though, that celebrities like Janet Mock or Caitlyn Jenner now are making this discussion more prevalent everywhere. So I feel like this is a discussion that, as an inclusive organization, we should be able to have with some cohesiveness. I'm going to just real briefly present a couple of terms and ideas. I've drawn on a lot of sources and just everyday life for this. But if you're interested in sort of the latest cutting edge of gender theory, I cannot recommend strongly enough a book called The Gender Book, which is by Mel Rife Hill, among others. Actually comes out of Houston, Texas, so I'm very proud of that. I also drew pretty heavily on Raven Caldera's work, particularly for some of the sacred kink, used Hermaphrodites as a starting point. Much more pagan than occult, but if you're interested in these topics, I cannot recommend those resources highly enough. And as I go through terms, I'm not asking for us to come to agreement. Particularly, I found resonant what Brother David Hill said yesterday about the fact that we learn the most sometimes where we disagree the most. So I'm putting forward a few ideas as starting points. If anyone would like to argue with me over drinks tonight and buy me a drink for my birthday, I am very, see what I did there? I'm very happy to talk about this stuff, and I want to invite all of us to make these topics a starting point rather than an end point. But just real quickly, there's a little smushed. What is the gender binary? It's the idea that there are two and only two genders, and you're in one or the other. It may or may not include the idea that those are immutable. So, there's female and there's male, and how could it be otherwise? Well, I'm here and I'm a dude with a rack, so let's keep talking. I'm just saying, my staff call me Uncle Boss, so there you go. Part of the larger gender umbrella beyond the gender binary includes people who would self-identify as trans or transgender. What does that mean? Most basic, it means that the gender you were assigned at birth by your doctor, who probably made a snap judgment based on your genitals, is not the gender with which you identify. Simple as that. I have known since I was 7 or 8 years old that I was not a girl. I don't necessarily identify fully as male, but I knew for a damn fact I was not a girl, and I spent most of my life figuring that out. This is not particularly uncommon for a variety of reasons. People may identify as trans, meaning that they were gendered female and are medically transitioning to male, or vice versa. They may identify as genderqueer, which is sort of where I put myself. If I am doing magic or having sex, I identify as male. The rest of the time, I don't really care much, and if people call me she or sister, I really just don't get my very domly panties in a wad. So this trans umbrella includes a lot of things, which are not just what we think of as somebody who is transitioning from male to female or female to male. It could include people who reject the gender binary entirely. It could include people who feel their gender is contextual, which is kind of where I'm at most of the time. It could include people who are very deliberately playing presentationally with different ideas of gender. I think that's close to what Carol Queen used to call gender fuck. There are people who identify as third genders. There are people who identify as no genders. A lot in San Francisco, it's not uncommon to hear many innovative pronouns that locate people in these different axes. Probably about a third of my staff prefers they pronouns because of where they're at. The other thing to really bear in mind is that this is as old as history, this is not new. And part of the reason why is that there are people who are medically intersex. This could involve having an extra chromosome or having ambiguous genitalia at birth. Often this is medically corrected for at birth, and when that happens, doctors are making their best damn guess. About 4% of the population are born intersex. So that I don't consider that a small or trivial matter. Beyond the idea that gender may be cultural, the fact is that sex itself, your genetic and embodied sex, is much more complex than we give credit for. Ancient cultures knew this better than we do because they had to. Ancient cultures did not have the option of what many doctors do now, which is to take children who are ambiguously sexed and try to fix them so that they will be accepted by their parents as quickly as possible. So the other thing I wanted to just sort of note in Gender Theory 101 is it's important to be aware that gender presentation may or may not align with gender identity. For example, there are many drag queens who are not trans. They are cis males who are also presentationally drag queens for performance. They may or may not consider themselves part of the trans umbrella. As I mentioned, looking at me from the outside, people will make their own assumptions about gender, which are wrong approximately 93% of the time. The only way I can know your pronouns for sure is if I ask you. And at the Sex Magic Coffee Social we run in San Francisco, we always start with names, preferred pronouns, as part of our introduction. Because I don't know. I just, real simple, cisgender. Some people have started taking exception to this term. Don't call me cisgender. Cisgender simply means individuals who identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. The term is Latin. It's the same. It's basically just saying it's the opposite of trans. If I've got scientists in the room, this is probably not controversial language. Cis and trans are used as markers for various scientific concepts all the time. The reason that it's starting to come into parlance in modern gender theory is so that we don't end up in a position where there are normal people and trans people. Because, as John Waters might say, it's not normal, it's just common, right? we don't need to other people. And the other thing is that within people who identify as cisgender, the idea of a gender essentialism, where women do X, Y, and Z because they are women, and men do X, Y, and Z because they are men, is restrictive, it's problematic, and a quick cross-cultural survey, even in modern times, not looking at historical change, a quick cross-cultural survey will tell us that gender is highly cultured. Within cultures, gender is not essentialist. And within our own lifetimes, I'm a little over 40 now, the definition of what is a woman and what is a man has changed very rapidly and very radically to become, I think, more inclusive. So the idea that a Fortune 500 cis woman CEO has the same experience as a Hollywood starlet, has the same experience as a Butch Leatherdyke, has the same experience as a Thelemite suburban soccer mom, could happen. I think we know this to not be true. The fact that all of these are cis women does not define their experience. And so I get a little bit tetchy at the idea that we conflate a lot of magical ideas with gender that are not necessarily about gender. The idea of passive being a feminine characteristic or in the physical plane, and active is feminine in the mental plane was good enough for Randolph in the late 19th century. It's not good enough for me, because I know from my experience that that's not entirely true or entirely gendered. As I mentioned earlier, it can feel like all this is really new stuff. It's not. In fact, I think we did a better job in ye old ancient times of Magick than we do now, because people were forced to deal with this, at least among intersex people. Societies had to make sense of this. And going back to the oldest recorded instances of magic, and particularly theurgy, when we look at the stories of Enki, when we look at the stories of Inanna, going back to ancient Sumer, going back to nearly 5,000-year-old texts, we know that there was a place for the trans experience, there was a place for the genderqueer experience as far back as we have recorded history. This is not new, this is stuff that we've lost. Some of the poems of Enheduanna give some interesting and somewhat different examples. This is from 2300 BCE. Inanna, dressing a maiden within the women's rooms, embraces with full heart the young girl with the handsome bearing, the vigor of a young man in his prime. Over the maiden's head she makes a sign of prayer, hands then folded at her nose, she declares her manly woman. In sacred rite she takes the brooch which pins a woman's robe, breaks the needle silver thin, consecrates the maiden's heart as male, gives to her a mace for this one dear to her. That comes from Medor's translation from Lady of the Largest Heart, which I really recommend. I also did quite a bit. Once upon a time, I thought I was going to become Indiana Jones and translate Sumerian. Then I discovered I have no aptitude for language. But if you look at Wolkstein and Kramer's Inanna, there are many, many other examples. And here's just one short passage that I remember striking me very hard when I was about 23. The people of Sumer parade before you. They're parading before Inanna. The women adorn their right side with men's clothing. The people of Sumer parade before you. I say, hail to Inanna, the great lady of heaven. The men adorn their left side with women's clothing. The people of Sumer parade before you. I say, hail to Inanna, the great lady of heaven. Hi there, Inanna. We're cool. Some of you may know this person over here. I'm not gonna say dude. So I can't get into all this. This is the 10-week course. This is beyond the scope of our conversation. But Sumer is not the only example. Mesopotamia, of course, has a long, damn history of transmuting ideas across time and across the Fertile Basin. Classical Judaism, if you look at many of the texts as late as medieval times, recognizes 6 genders. This is something that actually just started hitting the news a few weeks ago, which I was previously unaware of and am super freaking excited about. Mesopotamia in particular has a long history of transgender and cross-dressing temple personnel. In ancient Rome, the Galli were eunuch priests of Cybele and Attis, and it looks like that might be one of those cultural transmissions from the Mesopotamian Galu to, the Sumerian Gala, later Mesopotamian Kalu through the Babylonian, and then into the Galli of Rome. So these ideas, these ways of making sacred sense out of the lived experience of people between the worlds of gender has a long history. And of course, this isn't just about Europe. We see very, very similar ideas in literally all of the recorded history throughout the world. And then, of course, I love you.
I love you so much.
This goes down to our own times. And I find it fascinating that we see Baphomet strongly continuing to represent, even as we have this, I think of it as a historical accident, that some of our earliest ideas about sex magic in modern times happen to be coming up at a time in the Victorian era when people were really fascinated about sex and also really trying to figure out what was normal and what was pathological. And cross-dressing and transgender and genderqueer and homosexual and fetishism all sort of get lumped into the that ain't normal. And as somebody who does pretty much all of that, I say, fuck that noise. I'm a magician and I'm part of this culture too. But it really is almost an accident of history that you get people like Randolph both benefiting from the scientific discussion of sex, which is happening in Randolph's time, and recording this snapshot of where cultural mores were right then in a way that has almost overdetermined what we are still doing now. Randolph brought a great deal to the table. We actually studied his work recently in the Sex Magic Coffee Social. I am so fucking grateful that I didn't say I was going to drop F-bombs in this conversation, then it happened. Hi, recorded people. But, I'm so grateful that this exists, that somebody created a science, a magia sexualis. And I recognize that that needs to be a starting point and not an ending one. So fine. We come out of Randolph's context, and we come out of the context of the OTO, and we're here. We're not at some hippy-dippy reclaiming event. I say that as an initiated reclaiming witch. So why should we care? A lot of our magic is gendered, and I'm not saying that's wrong. The magic that came into Wicca through Gardner is very highly gendered. Nothing wrong with that, unless it's the only option at the table, right? So, we end up in this kind of accident of history that despite the fact that Crowley had very progressive ideas on gender, he really did. Crowley's pretty feminist for an old dude. We know he's a known bisexual. He had very progressive ideas on sex. He had very progressive ideas on gender. He had very progressive ideas on the potential of women as magicians and leaders. We still end up in a place where we're mostly talking about the gender binary when we talk about magic. Don't get me wrong. I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying throw out the gender binary. That is a powerful polarity. And there are about 93 other powerful polarities that both make gendered sex magic even better, and that are essential if we're going to make magic available and sex magic available to queer and genderqueer people. So I'm not here to criticize the existing state of affairs. I'm really here to think about how we can broaden what's available at the table. And this is not some crazy idea I came up with. My prophet actually said I had to do this. So who says we should care? This dude, Aleister Crowley. Commentary to the Book of the Law, 151. The Beast 666 ordains by his authority that every man and every woman and every intermediately sexed individual shall be absolutely free to interpret and communicate self by means of any sexual practices soever, whether direct or indirect, rational or symbolic, physiologically, legally, ethically, or religiously approved or no, provided only that all parties to any act are fully aware of all implications and responsibilities thereof and heartily agree thereto. If that's not the very definition of safe, sane, and consensual, I really don't know what is. And I owe a deep debt to Frauder, EO 131, for finding this quote and bringing it to my attention. We talk about male-female quintessential one. By the way, I do the boy parts in the anthem. I invite other genderqueer people to rep with me. The soul is beyond male and female as it is beyond life and death. Even as the lingam and the yoni are but diverse developments of one organ, so also are life and death but two phases of one state. So also the absolute and conditioned are but forms of that. In a different tradition, Victor Anderson talked about the clitorophallic god herself, which this brings to mind for me. And then, you know, many have said that there is room for queer and genderqueer magic for those who want it. I say that's for everybody. This constitutes a profound riddle of holiness. Not only understand it who combine, they only understand it who combine in themselves the extremes of moral idea, identifying them through transcendental overcoming of the antinomy. This is what happens when you learn words from reading. They must have gone further yet, beyond the fundamental opposition of the sexes. The male must have completed himself and become androgyne. The female become gynander. This incompleteness imprisons the soul. To think, I am not woman but man, or vice versa, is to limit oneself, to set a bar to one's motion. It is the root of the shutting up, which culminates in becoming Mary and Violet or a black brother. Right? So when I say I want to be looking at this broader perspective for the cis people in the room too, I mean that very strongly. Gender essentialism is not helping anybody's magic. So, oh yes, I have a note in here that says, to meet your time, you need to hit this by the 3:40 o'clock. So here, let's go beyond Gender 101. That was hella fun, not. I want to do some experiential work. And what I really wanted to start with is an exercise that we just did in the Sex Magic Coffee Social, which is, okay, what kinds of polarities can we think of top of mind? Where's my eraser? I have no eraser. Yeah, okay. Napkins, there we go. So, what do we got? What are pairs of opposites that we might want to work with in creating delicious tension and polarity as we work with a sex magic partner or a magical partner overall?
Top bottom.
Top bottom. Like that one.
Pain and pleasure.
Uh-huh.
Dark stuff.
Yep.
Pursuer and pursued.
Love it.
Hard and soft.
Master slave.
Mm-hmm.
Penetrating and enveloping.
Yep.
Hedonia and hedonia.
Oh, yeah.
Kind and cruel.
Active, passive.
Life and death.
Life, death, putrefaction. I heard that somewhere.
Slutty and pure.
Ooh.
Ooh,
Let's talk after class. What else? That one hasn't come up for me yet. I love it. Those are awesome. No more. Any more pairs?
Nude and clothed.
Nude and clothed. I like it.
Bound and unbound.
Mm-hmm. Girls are scary. Tie them up.
Yeah, I saw that sticker.
So this is perfect. So each one of these, just like in the Kabbalah, we have seeming opposites resolving to a center. And then just when you think you figured that out, it's going to do that again, right? So we've got the space between top and bottom. What is that? What are they generating?
The middle.
The middle, okay.
Sensation.
Sensation, that might be, yeah. These dudes?
Power play.
Power play, yeah.
Switch.
Pursuer and pursued. I now have hungry like the wolf in my head. I'm a dyke of a certain age. Okay, pursuer, pursued. What might that generate?
Tension.
Tension. Yeah.
Self-possession.
Self-possession. So, I'm not going to go through all of these, but when I think about, for me, I am in a DS relationship. I'm not in a 24/7 relationship. I have about as much time for that as I do for poly these days, which is not. But ultimately, that space is generating a very powerful and interesting feedback loop, right? It's ultimately what we have are two people who are building the middle, which is relationship. And ultimately, all of these pairs can be a way of building the middle, which is relationship. And not to dismiss gender, I think there is something very powerful in the fact, if only because people are enculturated differently as male and female, there's a kind of natural dissonance and you're kind of a space alien. I don't completely understand what's going on for you, and that interests me. That is part of our drive as humans. Again, as David was saying last night, we learn most from the people who are different than us. So there are many ways of generating difference. I personally feel that generating places of difference and discussion create an erotic tension in any circumstance. That can be you and I having a disagreement over drinks. if we define eros as a point of connection and the third which is generated, then eros is in all what Buber would call I-thou relationships. All right, we are interrelating. So these are different ways of interrelating, and I don't find it at all curious that a lot of particularly BDSM practices and leather culture are very dominant in the queer community and in the gay community. I think that's partially because once you've learned to come out about one thing, you may as well just do it all. You know, as long as we're out there, and I notice that with magicians too, right? Like, we're all out there as magicians, why shouldn't we just do what the hell we want? But I also think, particularly as I observe more of gay leather culture in San Francisco, of how important it is to have those moments of erotic dissonance, because they are places for discussion, they are places for literal verbal intercourse, they are places for co-creation that are powerful. And why should gay leathermen be the only ones that benefit? These are things that all of us can do to create points of dissonance which allow for generating third roads and generating third spaces, generating the liminal. And the liminal is where we do our work as magicians. I am pretty sure that everything you guys came up with might be on here. Oh, I've got light, dark, the space between being perception, of course, I stole that. Circumference and center, guardianship and edge walking, nurturing and nurtured. I'm in a daddy-girl relationship, so that tends to be my DS dynamic. I should have said handler animal, sadistic masochistic, clothed naked we got. And then also the other one that I think is available to all of us, and it's no accident, is positive negative. How many have childhood in the Mass? Almost everybody. Does it feel the same when you are childing as the positive child as the negative child? You know, like I said, now that I am forcefully using a machete to carve my way toward priesthood, I'm beginning to see roles for myself in the Mass that make sense to me. But for a very long time, I came into the OTO because I am a Mass slut, and because I am like all about the EGC. OTO's warming on me. But it's a joke. Don't kick me out. Okay. But,
well, okay.
Oh, thank you. The clergy. Okay. But in all seriousness, the childing was what I did for a long time. And I also knew, like for me, you know, I'm pretty much a top. Being the positive child always feels like I'm right at home. Fire and air, man, I'm right there. And when I do the negative child, I feel like I'm, you know, dancing backward in high heels, and I don't quite know what I'm doing. But I do work with both so that I can feel that experience. And something that I want to do in our exercise now is very quickly go through a place where, regardless of how you identify outside of this room, we're just going to experiment a little bit with that kind of dissonance in pair exercise and then switch. So do you still have your people from before? Do people need to find a person? Yes, you can do this in a poly way. Y'all figure out your own rules. It's all good.
Come on over to my house.
Hi. And you brought a cane, so yay. All right, no, seriously, guys. All right. This is going to be the simplest thing in the world. Hi, kids. We're talking about sex. I know we all have to giggle. Okay. Simplest thing in the world. One of you is above, one of you is below. One person is standing, the other is sitting. How does that change the dynamic between you? Just somebody stand up and just feel what that feels like. And if you want to like do these standing up, see what it feels like without talking. Just be in the position. Just feel what it feels like to be the stander. Feel what it feels like to be stood over. And if it feels a little bit silly, let it feel silly for another 15 seconds. And switch. And again, without talking, just feeling what does it feel like to be standing over this person that you were sitting before a minute ago. Okay. And we're just peeps now. We're just peeps. So, I want to talk a little bit more about some magical work that I innovated many years ago. And this actually comes out of some birthright work from reclaiming and fairy tradition, in which I'm also trained. I am not here to pimp for other traditions, but I want to use that as sort of a quick anchor for how I ended up evolving my own personal work. So those of you who are conversant with that tradition, I am shamelessly stealing a starting point. But in that tradition and in the way I was trained, there is a magical tool which I think of as very similar to our middle pillar exercises, to anchor oneself in center and in connection with the divine. So I'm going to take my three souls, I'm going to align my three souls, and then I'm going to be talking to the transpersonal souls, right? But I'm doing that from an anchored place. And in fairy, there are several different pentacles that are used. I'm saying a couple of nods. But daily work is done with what are considered the birthright powers of sex, pride, self, power, and passion. That also applies on different planes. You can sort of kick it up a notch and work with love, law, knowledge, liberty, wisdom, etc. So this got me thinking about, I know that I want my BDSM practices in particular, but all of my relationships to be egalitarian at their core, right? If I am just replicating systems of power over from the overculture, I have done not a lot of fucking good for my will or yours. There I go again. I talk about sex and then I start dropping F-bombs. This is a thing. So
You think we called it fucking?
you'd think we would. So, the idea is that you're running these iron forces from the earth, from your blood, and that's sort of where you come to center. this is the work of a lifetime. I do not have the capacity to talk about Iron Pentacle comprehensively today, or over drinks, or anywhere else. But it helped me innovate a piece of work that, as I was trying to move from an egalitarian relationship into choosing consensually to be in a different power relationship, in a different power exchange, oh, well, here's a place I can come back to. This is home. This is who I am when I am centered, right? For you, those may look different, but I invite you to think about, as you're working with any kind of sex magic polarity, what is the anchor? It might be the Sephirot, right? In fact, that would be very, very rich work. But what is the place of the centered normal, where nobody's standing up looking down on, nobody's sitting down looking up at, but we're just peeps, right? This came out of work I was doing when I was baby top. I had been a lifestyle submissive for many years. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I had some rope and I really liked it and I wanted to be playing around tying it, but I was, woo, okay, well, I don't know about this. So I started, I actually apprenticed with a dom who was a witch. And this came out of that practice. And the pairings that I started working with as I was trying to go into a caretaking and dominant headspace versus when I was trying to go into a surrendering and releasing headspace were very different. And so those pairs come up for me where, from that centered place of equality and eros, that becomes circumference, the holder, and center, the one being held, right? There's no inherent value to those two positions. Neither is better or worse. They're just different roles, different dynamics. Then working into, from a place of pride, being willing to be dominant. Going into that place of domination as the bottom goes into a place of submission. And anchoring that as sacred, right? Moving into a place of guardianship. So those of you who are familiar with DS might recognize that being a top is really scary, because you are in control of somebody else's experience during that portion. I would imagine anyone in here who's had an experience of being an initiator feels that same kind of honor and terror. So guardianship, which allows the person who is bottoming to go edge walking. Again, you can't exchange power you don't have. The person who is bottoming is doing probably the much harder work in this situation, as somebody who is initiated is at the center of the experience. So it's the guardianship of a good top that allows a bottom to go edge walking, right? And that's not necessarily about dom sub or about sadist masochist. I think in any situation, somebody who is facilitating an experience for the other goes through that. Similarly, control and release. If I am, as we say in San Francisco, flagging left, if I'm topping, I need to be in control of the situation. I need to know how to do things in a way that are safe. If I'm tying somebody up, I've got my EMT shears handy because I live in earthquake country. I'm in control so the other person can let go and release. And then most critically for me, at the place of passion, compassion and trust. If I'm really doing magic with you, then I am in relation with you, right? We're not fooling around. This is not role play. We are priesting something together. And that happens from a place of fully embodied compassion for the person who is at the center of the experience, and trust on the person who is going through that experience. And again, the relationship between this and between initiator and initiated really can't be overstated. It doesn't matter if I'm in a BDSM scene or if I'm in a ritual. If I am going through places where I am allowing myself to be helpless, that is a position of real power and real trust. And so, as we talk about all of these different potential polarities that are available to all people, cis or trans, queer or straight, asexual, right? All these different polarities are places of relationship. These are places where we are generating a third thing. And the reason why, ultimately for me, gender is not and cannot be the full picture of how we do sex magic. Randolph had a really resonant idea that I think is really important, which is, if you can use sex to have a baby, think about all of the other things you could create using sexual energy. That's a huge insight. I am very, very grateful to be in a magical tradition which had that insight and that made the idea and the practice of sex magic available to us. However, when I am doing magic, my goal is not to have a baby. It might be yours. I know people in our tradition who have children generated from magical acts. I applaud that. But I'm going to guess that 99.93% of the time, when we are doing this work, everybody here, we are not doing it because we want to have a baby. So the idea that gender is the only polarity completely breaks down. It makes more sense as magicians to say, this is the thing I want to generate. This is the magical idea that is closest to this thing I want to generate. What is the polarity, or are the polarities, that might most fit with that for this particular ritual? And as we do that, we can construct very resonant magic that will help us get to a much closer sense of what we are trying to bring into the world, a much closer resonance. When we do Kabbalistic work, if I'm working with Yesod, I've got the moon and I'm making reflections and I've got purple everywhere and I'm building a temple that is Yesod central. I should be doing that in my magical work with polarity as well. I should be thinking about the polarities that make the most sense for the metaphorical magical child that I'm trying to create. And gender can become a shortcut to doing that rather than an intentional part of the work. And intention is what we do. The other thing I want to say is that these things are not one-to-one. I am, let's see, on this thing, I'm a top. I like giving pain. I also really like pleasure because that's awesome. I am 90% a dom. Sometimes I am a sub. And, I like rope. But, I might at the same time, I can be a dom and I can be a masochist. I can order my girl to beat me. What else would I do? So as we think about different ways of polarity, or of being in polarity, I would caution us from getting back to that same place where left side is always left and right side is always right. It's another way of reducing our complexity, and it's not, I think, particularly rich. Very quickly, I'll do some acknowledgments, and I'll have just a couple of minutes for questions, but I did want to do some quick shout outs. A lot of this work got workshopped at the Sex Magic Coffee Social, which is co-sponsored by Blazing Star Oasis in San Francisco, which we hold at Wicked Grounds, yay. I am deeply indebted to Brother Ben over here for always inspiring me to think about these things and finding those quotes. I also want to give a shout out to Thorne Coyle, who has spoken locally before and who was my primary teacher for sort of the other half of this, and who also is just awesome in terms of queering magic. And everybody, particularly at NOTOCON, who has listened to variations of this presentation over the year, because really I'm still doing all the Kabbalah you really need to know in 72 minutes or less. I've got about 8 minutes for questions. Yes?
What is TOTOCON, and are you willing to give me the address for Wicked Grounds?
Oh, you're sweet. Your check's in the mail. For those of you who don't know, TOTOCON is the Texas Regional OTO Convention. It's usually about 60 people. It's been in Austin. Y'all are going on 9 years? Yeah, I was actually an on-site organizer for TOTOCON 3, and I didn't die. And so it's amazing. It's a lot of the local people you see around here participate in TOTOCON, and it's really good, just much smaller. Where is Wicked Grounds? 8th Street at Folsom in San Francisco. Technical address is 289 8th Street. And if you come out for Folsom Street Fair, we'll be like right across the street with a line out the door. So, yeah. Yes, and your check is in the mail. Other questions, comments, complaints, concerns? Mostly questions?
I have one correction for title to your slide.
Oh, please.
Male, female, quintessential one.
Yes.
It's
Oh.
not male, comma, female, it's male hyphen female.
Thank you. Thank you. That's critical.
Yes. That's forgotten.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you all for being part of this. I'm really grateful that you came, even though it meant I couldn't go see Bob talk. And hopefully these conversations will continue. Love is the law, love under will.